Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration of Detroit. Just to go back at some of the cities that we've looked at recently here on the Restitutor Orbis channel. Most recently, we looked at Indianapolis, and we started our city explorations with Chicago, and now we're heading to Detroit. Detroit is the interesting city sitting right at the major intersection point between Ontario and Michigan in Canada and the United States, respectively. Interestingly enough about Detroit is that it was originally supposedly settled by the Mound Builders, the legendary Native American civilization that existed in this area. We've come across them before in the historical account. It was also originally settled by a French settler or explorer, or an explorer who had settlers hanging out with him in 1701, a gentleman by the name of Cadillac. And yes, I'm going to pronounce it that way because that's how it's pronounced currently. Don't you feel me, people of the great city of Louisville? Did I get that right? In any event, looking at Detroit, we see where it sits, and it's quite an interesting city with a very unique history. And of course, we'll look in depth at that history. One of our major points of interest, though, is Michigan Central, which is a train station, interesting enough, not called Union Station. And we see where it sits right here on the tracks, and we'll go to our aerial imagery. And we see what an incredible building it is, and currently it's being renovated. Detroit has quite a colored history in United States parlance because in the 1980s, I recall many people talking about how Detroit was the murder capital. There's even a line about it in the famous Goonies movie. In any event, the city has come a long way now, and now it's being restored, but it has a very rich and textured history, and for our purposes, very many allusions to the old world. You can see here the train tracks and how they run into this little tunnel, and the tunnel goes right underneath what they call the Detroit River, and then it runs over into Windsor, which is in Canada, and the train tracks come back up there. It's about 1.6 miles that this tunnel runs under. It's one of the first things we'll be taking a look at. Another interesting thing about Detroit is that it was featured quite prominently in the War of 1812. It's not one of the U.S. Army's finer moments, as one of the greatest surrenders in U.S. Army history occurred here during the War of 1812, and General Hull surrendered to a vastly inferior force. And he was court-martialed to be shot, but fortunately pardoned by President Madison at the time. And then there was a subsequent defeat in the Battle of Frenchtown. But fortunately, the U.S. Navy was up to the task, and Oliver Hazard Perry managed to liberate Detroit, or bring it back under U.S. control, when he won the Battle of the Great Lakes. All right, let's get into the exploration of Detroit. So here's our initial renderings of Detroit, or drawings as it were, when it was just a fort, and we presume this to be sometime 1790, so therefore these are the fortifications at the disposal of General William Hull when he attempted to defend it from the vastly inferior besieging force of British, Canadian militia, and Native Americans that attacked him. Word on the grapevine was that the reason he surrendered was the fact that he lacked proper munitions, and then he also feared a Native American massacre. I guess he never heard of what happened to Colonel Monroe and his force when he surrendered Fort William Henry Harrison to a combined force of French and Native Americans. Regardless, we see the typical layout of a star fort, and then we see an outer wall. We also see that the concept of the Star Fort has always been labeled with the historical depictions of the city. What kind of accuracy is that in these depictions? We have no idea, because once again, these are drawings, these are not pictures. So do these really prove anything? No. These prove that someone can draw some great pictures, and that's about it. Now, these could be accurate, they may not be accurate. But to new viewers of the channel, we always ask these questions because these drawings don't prove anything, and as we know, images and pictures don't necessarily prove anything, although they can provide clues, and that's how we approach these explorations. We see that it's an interesting dichotomy in the two layouts that we've looked at already, where we have the Star Fort away from the initial settlement, and then we look at a subsequent plan of Detroit, where we see the way that all the streets run away from the Detroit River. And we see that that's considered one of the base designs, and this seems to be building out the city even more. Isn't it interesting how they had this kind of intricate planning already as part of the design this early in the time frame? Now, this plan of Detroit is supposedly from the early 19th century, although again, I always question the years on the references with these aspects, because really they can assign whatever year they want to it. Now, if you're content to believe whatever the historical account tells you, well, that's fine. You can believe that, and you don't want to ask any questions. This is a latter picture of Detroit, and we see the same layout in the 1870s. Again, just another rendering or drawing, which could be done by anyone at any time. We see some more buildings, and yet we still see the same pattern in the build out to the neighborhoods and many of the buildings on the Detroit River. We also see a lot of naval traffic, which makes sense as this is in between the Great Lakes. Although the Great Lakes themselves are very interesting, as due to the fact that they are not depicted on earlier maps of North America at all. But of course, we'll explain that by saying those cartographers from that time frame had no idea what they were doing, and maybe the explorers just couldn't miss a Great Lake. Or maybe they didn't report a Great Lake and therefore it didn't end up on the maps. This is the Detroit Soldiers and Sailors Monument, their monument to the United States Civil War that was built in the early 1870s, so they were a little bit earlier to the game. While it may not compare in height and just simple magnitude to the one that we looked at in Indianapolis, it's still very beautiful. I find it interesting that they put what appears to be, or what they state, is a Native American princess, I suppose, or some sort of warrior on top of this monument for the United States Civil War. Fascinating. Although when we look at her a little closely, she looks like she's a member of the Union Army Valkyrie Regiment, who the Confederates feared greatly when they fought in the South. Now, I'm being a little facetious, but again, it's one of these very questionable monuments, and it causes me to question exactly what they're depicting here. And why do we always see this depictions of things that don't really make a lot of sense? Why would they represent a Native American woman on top of a monument to Civil War veterans? And supposedly this was completed in the early 1870s, 1872, if records are to be believed. And that's only 7 short years after the Civil War. Most of the other monuments were completed in the 1880s or the 1890s, as though the United States Civil War was not to be recognized until a few decades had passed. And here's how the monument looks in one of the earlier pictures that we have of Detroit from the early 20th century. And we see the typical traffic that we'd expect to see in a very magnificent building and a very well built out city block with many lines on it. So an early photograph that gives us some clues that there may have been existing structures here that had always been here, unless we want to go with the historical account that these were all built by the great people of Detroit and that they had done so after the Civil War. Of course, the tall building across from the monument, we'll be told, was constructed sometime in the 1890s, which was when skyscrapers suddenly became available and the ability to build multi-story buildings was something easy. I always enjoyed this sign to Detroit. Welcome to Detroit, the Renaissance City, founded in 1701. That's right, Cadillac just founded it, right? Isn't it funny how we always see that term? And it's even more fitting that this sign is depicted right next to this amazing building. You'll never guess what this amazing, beautiful building is, as you see the pediment and the incredible tower, although frequent viewers of the channel who've been part of the other city explorations will probably have a good idea of what this building is and what it represents. If only we had such facilities available today, imagine the things that we could achieve. I guarantee you that your mail would never be late. And mail isn't late anymore, is it? Here's a Detroit Opera House, and isn't it intriguing that we have this kind of building for an opera house? Why do we not have opera houses in every city anymore, or every town? It's also interesting when you think about the fact that there's some very small towns across the Midwest United States that have their own opera house. I think the smallest town I've ever been in is a town called Mantorville in Minnesota. It barely breaches 1,000 people, if census records are to be believed, and it has its own opera house. So, I mean, if a little town like that can have its own opera house, well, why doesn't every town have its own opera house? I mean, the opera may be in town, and imagine what everybody could do for the time being. Here's another photograph looking in Detroit in the in the 1890s. Again, if the time frame from the photo is to be accepted. And we see some very well built out buildings with some great detail in them, and we have the usual interest in detail on the streets. Do we see the tracks? Is this a brick street? Is this a paved street? Hard to tell for sure. Although we see the horse and buggies parked very well, almost like they're cars in a way. And we see a little bit of activity with some people walking around. So clearly this is not from a time when photographs could not capture the activity of people in town. And it's quite telling that we actually see some people walking around. Here's a more sweeping panorama of that same block in the same time frame. And our first look at the City Hall, which we'll be taking a look at later, along with the building and the monument that we saw earlier. And I always found this to be a very telling photo of early Detroit because it gives us the impression that there's a lot more build-out already in this city. Now we can say, well, it was originally founded in 1701. They had plenty of time. They could have built these buildings, and yes, those factors are true. But I always find it very interesting in terms of how fast the ability to construct buildings like this progressed in the 19th century. And I don't think Detroit's any exception with the way it depicts this in these images that we see. Now, I fully accept that we don't know the exact years on these photos. We only have years that are assigned to them by either whatever department of history we're interfacing with, or the university that keeps them in official records, or of course our own government records, which we know that we can trust beyond any shadow of a doubt. And now we're looking at the central tunnel that we looked at earlier on the map that runs as part of the railroad. Now they constructed this from 1906 to 1910, or excuse me, 1906 to 1910, an underground tunnel that went under the Detroit River for 1.6 miles or 2.6 kilometers. Very amazing civil engineering achievement to, one, be able to tunnel this out at that time frame, and then two, be able to construct this in such an effective and efficient manner. I mean, really 4 years, and here's one of the construction pictures that we have of it. Make of it what you will, and by all means, let me know in the comments what you think of a picture like this, what's really going on here with this tunneling operation. Although we've got, again, multiple accounts about how this project unfolded and what were some of the challenges that they faced. Still, I think it's pretty impressive that they accomplished this in 4 years in the early 20th century. The early 20th century, of course, being a very ambiguous time in terms of what technological capabilities we had. And, of course, we have the picture of the supposed men in authority wearing their really cool hats as they're watching one of the boats moving into position to drop some of the tunneling apparatuses into place. It's an interesting photo, and this is the kind of story that they're going to tell us when they talk about how they constructed this tunnel and how they did it so efficiently within 4 years. Now, maybe they really achieved this, and maybe they really achieved this in the manner that's being depicted. However, I think we have to ask questions about how they were able to do it so effectively. The other interesting thing is this tunnel still operates today, and the basic infrastructure, the original infrastructure, still stands. There's been little to no improvement or renovation done on this tunnel, although there's been plenty on buildings, and yet this tunnel stands perfectly well today, only 110 years after its completion. Well, more like 113 years to be precise. Very interesting, and the fact being is that we always talk about our crumbling infrastructure in the United States, and we're always told about it, and yet here we have the very same Detroit River Tunnel that the trains go under, and there apparently seems to be no issue with it. It definitely communicates some things about the quality of construction, and we'll be told that they simply had more artisans and they worked harder in the early 20th century, and that's how they were able to build such a piece of infrastructure that endures so well to this day that they haven't had to invest a lot of time and money in renovations on. And fortunately, there hasn't been any sort of collapse or structural issue with this tunnel. I also find this picture very interesting because here we see a different kind of train going down the tunnel. Electric motor from eastbound tube under Detroit River with Michigan Central Train, Detroit, Michigan. So very interesting what we see with these kind of photos. And these are the kind of questions that we have to ask because at this point, how long has the tunnel been down there? How old is the tunnel and how old is the construction material within the tunnel? And now we go on to look at churches. Here we have the Cathedral Church of St. Paul, constructed in 1907, and we see the usual hallmarks of the amazing construction capabilities of the early 20th century. Beautiful towers, an incredible window, may possibly have had a cymatic purpose originally in terms of when this building was originally constructed, unless we want to go with the historical account that it really was built in 1907 by the finest efforts of the good people of Detroit. And if they did pull this off, I do wonder why we don't build buildings like this now. It's a very beautiful building, and I find it very alluring. The construction time frame on it tends to vary a little bit, though. This is the Cathedral of the Most Blessed Sacrament, and we have a little bit of a different construction account on this one. They say this one, it took them from 1913 and 1930 to build, so a little bit more of a challenge, but definitely has some echoes of some of the major cathedrals over in Europe. And of course, again, we see the main central window with the two amazing towers. Incredibly beautiful church. And I wonder what kind of material they really used in terms of the walls and the foundation. And one of the things I constantly lament in many of these videos is that we have preciously few, as in none, photos of the construction of the foundation. This is the interior, and just an incredibly beautiful church. I mean, it's a cathedral. But say it's a church, but a cathedral. And we see the same hallmarks of that construction style with the many arches and entryways and just the vast amount of interior space in a building like this. And of course, we always suspect what's the original purpose of these incredible cathedrals that we see in all of these American cities, and how do they compare to the great cathedrals of Europe? Well, it's a subsequent exploration that we're going to be getting to on the channel, and I look forward to it. Because believe it or not, the cathedrals in the New World compare quite favorably to the cathedrals in the so-called original Old World. This is Saint Anne de Detroit. Okay, I know, it's a French name. Please excuse me. It was built in 1886 to 1887, and this is a very beautiful cathedral as well. Although, look at the towers and interesting design on that window, I have to say, as well. And did it serve the same purpose, or were there different purposes? Isn't it interesting how these churches and cathedrals, regardless of what they're classified as, always seem to have interesting similarities to their layout? I wonder if that really reflects the original function, or was that just because of the building principles at the time? And then here's the interior, and another gorgeous interior, again with the many archways and windows, and look at the floor with the design in that floor and the unique pattern on that. And I wonder if that's a granite floor, and this is definitely, well, all three of these churches or cathedrals or whatever we want to call them. I would love to visit all three of these structures just to get an idea of what their internal construction components are. It's always a lot more telling when you can go into a building and you can ascertain exactly what they used to build it, or at least get an idea for how solid it is. Or you could just watch a video and take the person presenting the video to you at their word, and, it may be true, especially if it's the media, right? And here we look at the City Hall of Detroit, and this is the 1870s City Hall. And this is what we'd expect for a 19th century city hall, isn't it? Very well built out, beautiful tower, little clock on it. Many aspects to the construction, along with the many different arches. And I like the way that the building seems to bring attention to it. And that's always something interesting about these old world buildings. And I do wonder about the true origin and function of this building because, again, why do you need a building like this for a city hall? Or a post office, or a federal office, or a district court, or whatever we tend to designate them as. And then here's the older city hall from the 1840s time frame. Yes, they considered this one a much more modest one. Really, you'd think that a city hall like this would still be suitable for the functions of a city. Of course, they say they always need more space because as a city grows, so does the bureaucracy. And when the bureaucracy grows, you need more employees, right? In any event, very beautiful building, and while it may be smaller, it is certainly not a slouch by any comparison. I mean, look at the little cupola with the tower, and I like the tower on top of it, and we can already see well-developed buildings. Couldn't get an exact date on this photo, although supposedly this was from the 1890s. And now let's go to the Detroit Art Museum. This is a very intriguing building that existed from 1885 to 1960, or so we're told. And this was the original component of it that was built in 1885. And of course, you see we have nothing short of a castle, or some people would call it a series of arches with some towers on it. I really enjoy the fact that it looks like that stone has been there for a very long time. And I've had some people tell me, well, it's simply the effect of rustification, which is an actual process in architecture. And yes, of course it is. There's always an explanation in architecture along with a fancy term for how you explain what kind of building style a building is. Now, this is apparently in the early 20th century where they've expanded the Detroit Art Museum. Well, I guess you're going to need more room to display your art than just the little front of that building. It's interesting, though, if you compare this photo to the previous photo, and you wonder if somehow the previous photo was altered in some way. Not that I'm meaning to suggest that. Maybe this photo is altered. Because we don't know when we look at photos. We don't know what ground truth reality is. The only way to know would be to jump in the DeLorean, go back in that time frame, and see what the building really looked like in 1885. Isn't that ironic that it is the year 1885 to any fans of that movie? I love the arches and the stairs going up to that, and I really enjoy the smaller subsidiary towers, and here's another picture of it. And you still have the tops on these towers, and it gives this building a very beautiful and fairy tale appearance. These are the kind of appearances that we would be delighted to see in our buildings, whether this is in a larger city like Detroit or a smaller town. I recall looking at a library that looked somewhat similar to this in La Crosse, in Wisconsin, in the Mississippi River Valley, that had towers like this. But I suppose the reason it appeals to us so much is we can tell how a building like this really activates our imagination, our creative inspiration, and aspects that we may not fully understand about ourselves. When we see buildings like this, we question how they came to be and how they were constructed at that time frame. And here a closer look at the stairs and some of the arches, and again we see the scaling with the construction of columns, something that seemed to be no difficulty for whoever or whenever this building was constructed. I also like the detail that you see in the windows and the arches on the windows in the tower. And then of course we have the usual base stones going around the stairs. And I wonder where this came from. Was this limestone? Was this Indiana limestone that they hauled up there? Well, I mean, look at the blocks that are even above the archways in between the levels of this building. Just an incredible achievement. And of course, we'll be told, well, they had artisans, they had craftsmen, they had people who were willing to work, and there were no safety standards, and that's how they were able to build an amazing art museum like this. I mean, I certainly can't argue with why you'd want a building that would look like this to display art in. That part actually does make sense to me. I just wonder, why is it that this building was something that could be achieved in 1885, and I wonder if there's a contractor who would even give you a bid or any sort of design if you requested a building like this. Imagine if you took this picture, you had multiple schematics of it. I would like this building built and I would like it done within 3 years. I wonder what they'd tell you. Here's the court from it, the internal look, and look at the little tower and the windows, and look at all the different colors in the brick. Just gorgeous. I mean, everything about this building does reflect art, and there's no arguing with that point. Well, why is it we don't have our buildings reflect art? Well, it's because our buildings need to reflect functionality and cost, because we have such limitations in cost now. That's what we'll be told. We don't act like we don't have an unlimited debt ceiling and that we can't just seem to throw infinite amounts of money at whatever world issues that we have, regardless of what nation we are. I mean, that's what we're told. Of course, they'll always warn us about the dangers of hyperinflation, but then they keep enacting the same policies. Here's a later picture of the Detroit Art Museum, and here you can see they've unfortunately ripped off the tops of the towers on each of the towers, the fairy tale aspect of it. Probably trying to make it look more like a quote-unquote modern building. Yes, indeed. Why is it this always happens to these buildings? And this was clearly shortly before its unfortunate demolishing in the period of urban renewal in the 1960s. I always found it ironic that urban renewal hit all the major American cities from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, and then in the 1970s and 1980s there was a reputation of American cities that, well, we'll just say they weren't the best. All right, now we're going to take a look at the schools of Detroit. This is Cooley High School, built in 1928, and it's been featured on many different explorations, and you've probably seen the interior of it, but looking at the exterior, we're told that it's some sort of Mediterranean revival style. What else would it be? I'm surprised they don't call it Pirates of Darkwater revival style. Does anybody remember that show? It didn't last very long. Yeah, I'm dating myself there. Regardless, a very beautiful building, and look at the towers, and then you see some of the details on the doorway. Why do you need a high school to look like this? I mean, I'm not complaining. I'm just wondering, why can't we give, modern students a high school like this in the United States? Gorgeous high school in the city of Detroit with beautiful towers and a nice big clock there in the middle. Because remember, we didn't have any kind of handheld pocket watches at that time in 1928. I mean, I guess it does go with the narrative that it was the roaring 20s, and this was before the Great Depression, and here we have a group of students coming out the doorway. But looking closely at the doorway, look at the ornate detail in the columns with the twist around it, and then some of the detail above both the arched doorways, and again seeing the scaling with the columns there in the arched doorways. Thomas M. Cooley High School, very proud name. And look at the different coloring in the bricks, too. And then even the detail in the windows, as though they spared nothing with this building. In 1928, I wonder who was just wandering around there as a construction contractor who said, yes, we can do this. Here's one of the internal shots of Cooley High School, and even the woodwork is very beautiful and reminds us of many of the state capitals that we've looked at in early explorations on this channel. Just thinking, looking at that woodwork, and then even there you have columns, because we can't resist putting columns and pillars everywhere in these older buildings, it seems. Perhaps that was some sort of essential requirement. It couldn't be because they were part of a construction kit that were available in many different sizes, and we'll be doing a subsequent exploration where we actually examine columns. Here's the beautiful auditorium, and this is what it looked like when the building was more in use. Just a gorgeous auditorium, although we'll look at a different angle here in a second. And remember, this is just an auditorium in a high school. Now again, I'm not degrading the importance of education or anything like that, But we're always told by our government throughout the ages how important education is. We could do something like this back in 1928. Why does it seem so difficult to do now? And please let me know in the comments. And here is one of the subsequent photos of the beautiful auditorium in the Cooley High School after it's deteriorated quite a bit. Yet even after deterioration, you can still see the beauty and the detail in it. And you see it's kind of a tragedy that this building was just left to deteriorate like this. And yet at the same time, it does preserve a look at some of the detail within this auditorium. And the question has to be asked again, why would a high school require that kind of detail? And now we move on to our next school. This is Central High School. Why do they always have a Central High School in these towns? I'm reminded of Duluth. And this was built from 1893 to 1896. Quite a beautiful high school. And again, you see the similar trappings with the incredible tower and the beautiful towers and subsidiary towers. Because one tower is not enough. You need more than that. Because how else are they going to know that it's a high school? Again, why can't we get high schools like this today? This building is still with us today, and it's very beautiful, and it's now part of Wayne State University in Detroit. And they call it Old Main. And why do they always call these older buildings Old Main, I wonder? I'm reminded of Old Main, the Soldiers' Home near Milwaukee. And it has many similar building aspects to it with the big, huge clock tower and the other pointy towers, and then even seeing the large stone construction towards the base. And of course, you have the large arched doorways. Otherwise, how are you going to know where the doorway is if you don't have a large arch around it? This is an interior photo, and we see the similar hallmarks with the beautiful columns. Looks like it's made out of marble. Wonder what the floor is made out of, if it's solid granite as well, because again, I'm given reminders of what many of the beautiful state capitol buildings that we've explored look like when you look at the interior of this building. That's an academic building and was originally constructed as a high school in 3 years, 1893 to 1896, because boy, could we build them back then. I don't know what it was with that time frame in the 1890s. I mean, look at this, with this stairway and the arch over it and the detail everywhere. As though they just had so much time on their hands that they were happy to do this kind of detail, to have a school ready to go and do it in 3 years, easily, so students could attend and be inspired every time they walk up those stairs. Causes me to reconsider some of the schools I went to growing up, and I'm beginning to wonder which ones were old world buildings, and maybe we'll have to take a look at some of them for future explorations, if they're interesting enough. I mean, look at this here. Again, you see this detail above this doorway. Why would you put the wreath in there? What's that all about? And what's that really signifying if this is indeed from an older civilization? I do wonder. And again, I'm wondering exactly what the floor is made out of, and you see that the pillars in the wall look like they're made out of some very solid material, whether it's granite, limestone, or sandstone, or whatever other type of stone that we'll be told that was hauled in from some vast distance and was part of the easy construction. Even a classroom has a bit of a detail to it when you look at the ceiling, and it just doesn't seem like this was a building that was originally supposed to be a high school. And yet we're told that it was built from the ground up to be a high school. Well, I'm not sure what to think of this one. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. It's just another question of why is it that we had older buildings that were this beautiful, this ornate, and this detailed in Detroit, and now we don't have this currently. And now we've reached Michigan Central Station, and this is the original one, of course, from the 1860s, because if you're going to have a central station, you're going to have multiple incarnations of it. And even the original one from the 19th century looks very beautiful with the large clock tower, and maybe if it was from the mid-19th century, I could buy the fact as to why they need clock towers, because at that time, Waltham wasn't up with producing enough pocket watches. But then after the United States Civil War, anyways, apparently the old central station was falling apart and suddenly burned down, surprise, surprise. So in a year, 1913 and 1914, they built this beauty. And this is one of the original postcards, apparently right from 1914 as construction was completed and it was opened. Yes, this was a rush job in the early 20th century. Again, our building methods and our ability to rapidly plan, design, and construct these buildings is just incredible. But don't worry, someone will tell you that these buildings could be done today very easily. Well, here's what it looks like more recently. It has fallen into disrepair, and yet we can still see a lot of the styling details on the original train station with the large columns and 3 pediments there, not just 1 or 2. And just look how unbelievably tall this building is. And we looked at this initially when we did our map exploration. And apparently this is being revived and renovated by the Ford company currently, and it's supposed to be reopened this year. So at least this is one old world building that has survived and is being renovated. This is a photo of it from the 1950s when it was still in use, and you can see that it already looks incredibly old, although it's only about 40 years old in this picture. Well, make of it what you will. And intriguing that we see the detail on it, and yet this building looks like it's a lot older than 40 years. I don't know, maybe I'm just imagining things, or you get those rough winters in Detroit and maybe the buildings get stained. And here's another photo of it from the 1980s. Looks like you got a Nissan Pulsar there, or is that a Mazda? Oh, okay, sorry, I get distracted sometimes. And you can see how the building more or less looks like it's holding up well structurally another 30 years later. Yet we see the same discoloration on it, as though it just appears as though it's very, very old. Although, again, only about 70 years if this is the mid to late 1980s, which it looks like this photo is correct if we go off of the model of cars. Here's an internal photograph of the train station. Again, just beautiful with the massive columns, the beautiful arches. And this is another building that clues to different uses and different functions. And why do you need windows that large anyway? Are you really looking out of them at any point in time? And if you're just a passenger in a train station, you're only concerned about getting to your next train. No, I need to walk under these very amazing and beautiful ceilings with these cool designs in them so I can get distracted and miss my train. Look at this hallway. Just incredible. An elaborate amount of detail for a train station. And really, I think it's unfortunate that they ever allowed this building to fall into disrepair. And of course, we'll be given the usual reasons that number of passengers and income was declining. And of course, we couldn't find support from the government because money only comes from the government when it's convenient and not when we need it to save a building. Just look at the way that it's carved in with some of the aspects on the ceiling. And here you see some of the columns and someone going to get their tickets with a nice large clock above it. Because, you need to have a ceiling that's at least 30 feet high, although it's better if it's 50 to 100 feet high. Those are the best train stations, and they run most efficiently. And if you have huge columns in them, that's going to make them run even more efficiently. Just look at any of the Union stations that we've looked at in previous explorations, going all the way back to our very early exploration of Union Station in Kansas City. And now we go to Detroit's incredible buildings. This is the Guardian Building, built 1927 and 1928. That's right, 1 year to erect this incredible building, that Art Deco period. And isn't it interesting how it's both a skyscraper that has beauty and artistic design put into it? And of course, we'll just be told, well, that was the stylings of Art Deco. We don't do that now because fiscally, that's not responsible. And why would we want to build a beautiful building these days when you can build nice square-looking glass and steel towers that reach up into the sky? Gorgeous building, and even the roof of it looks like it has a lot of beautiful detail with it. Here's our construction photo, and again, make of it what you will. I find the little building to the right of it very interesting as well. It kind of reminds me almost of the Mitchell building in Milwaukee. And what do you think of this construction photo? I'm not going to offer my opinion on it because I think you can guess just by looking at the sky on this one, and it doesn't look like they tried very hard. Here's an interior photo of the Guardian Building, and look at the design and detail within this, with the different colorations and the patterns. And this really gives you the impression of a building that's from another time and another place. A skyscraper that was part of a different civilization. Of course, we'll be reassured that it's from the Art Deco time. Right. Look at this entryway here with a desk and the way each of the halls has a triangular pattern with details in each of the triangular patterns. And then it goes all the way down the hall and what looks to be to a series of elevators. This is definitely a building I want to go visit in person because this is a beautiful building. And even as Art Decos go, this is incredibly beautiful. I mean, 1 year to achieve all of this detail and all this design. I mean, at least it was the Roaring 20s, and we haven't fallen in the Great Depression yet. Although the interesting thing about the Great Depression is how we know that the United States government seemed to have no limitations on its funds, and then, of course, when we had the Gold Act, that helped its funds. Look at that beautiful depiction of Michigan back there as a state. What is really being depicted here, I wonder? Is this just an artistic impression, a beautiful design that inspires us? And it most certainly does. Or is this representing something else? You know, when you look at things like this, you can almost imagine this building inspiring some sort of science fiction movie. I mean, they could have very easily filmed Blade Runner here. Look at these exterior details. What's this really depicting? It's another Native American. Of course, that's what we'll be told. But is it? And look at that. The ornate beauty in both the structure and the coloration. Really, this building defies words to describe, both internally and externally. And while it's beautiful externally, it really has its story told on the internal aspects of it. All this in a year, and they could achieve this? And what's the story? Well, we just had all these craftsmen and all these hard workers that were willing to be there. Very interesting depiction of Michigan, now looking at that wall mural closer. And just a tremendous mural. And I wonder how large this one is, and this is something certainly I'd love to see in person. Yes, it looks like we have some modern paintings towards the ground. Well, let's move on to the Fisher Building. The Fisher Building, another one-year wonder or 15-month wonder that just happened to be completed in 1928, because I guess the Guardian Building wasn't enough art deco for Detroit. And this is the postcard of it, and as you can see, it actually looks like it takes up an entire city block for this building. And here's a more modern picture of it, and here you can see that there's some more beautiful exterior styling on this Art Deco building from 1928. And just remember that, 15 months. That's what they tell us. It took them 15 months. Again, it was the Roaring '20s, and oh, by the way, they were also building the Guardian building at the same time. Well, it was Detroit, and I guess they figured, why not put up two beautiful Art Deco buildings that people would remember for all time, if we want to go with the historical account. This one has even more exterior beauty, though, I think, than the Guardian, just a little bit. But that's just my opinion. I mean, they're both gorgeous buildings. And certainly, they exceed anything that we build today. Look at this interior with this kind of design and detail. And look at the floor to the walls to the ceiling. And just the amount of time and effort that went into this. 15 months? 15 months. Why don't you just call this wonder building architectural style? The fact that they even expect us to stomach that. I mean, look at this. This isn't just a building that's tall. This is a building that covers a lot of area as well, with a dome and beautiful lights hanging down from it, and again, concentric archways. And look at the floor again. This is a very large building. And I'm just, again, speechless when I look at the interior of this. This is in Detroit. True, unbelievable beauty that was achieved in the 1920s or so, we're told. And if we really could achieve this in the 1920s, regardless of how it was possible, this is where we really have to ask some hard questions. We just opt not to build like this anymore because we're all about cost effectiveness here in the mighty 21st century? Is that really our best answer? But here we've got $1 trillion to develop an F-35 fighter, but we just don't put it in buildings anymore. You know, we're going to need that fighter. By the way, have you heard about that fighter being used in a current regional conflict? Neither have I. Look at this. Just incredible beauty with the reflection in the lights. And again, this is something that's otherworldly. This is something that's fantastical beyond the ability of words to describe. And you could see any science fiction or fantasy movie being filmed in a building like this. Well, now we save the best for last. The Detroit Masonic Building, as you can see by the postcard, built from 1920 to 1926. This is the largest Masonic building in the world, with over 1,000 rooms inside of it. We looked at the incredible Masonic building in Indianapolis, and we thought there was nothing that could compare to that. And yet we find the largest Masonic temple in Detroit, Michigan. And the postcard doesn't do it justice, but you have to ease your way into this one. Look at the gorgeous beauty and the magnitude of this building. And they did this in 6 years? Now we're just looking at the exterior, and yet we see something that's a castle, a palace, a capital of perhaps some vast region. One wonders what the original purpose was. Now, yes, I played a little game where I inserted this picture in earlier, but just to show you that, can you really tell a difference between this and the Art Deco style? Or does this indicate that there's a style that some previous civilization used on the Fisher, the Guardian, and this Masonic temple buildings? That's what I really wonder. And I'd like you to let me know what you think in the comments. Because what does this really represent? What is this really all about? I mean, I know we're told that this is a Masonic temple, and yes, this is the actual picture from the Masonic temple, being honest with you this time. But sometimes I think it's important to ask questions and not take everything we're told at face value. This is very much a building I would love to see in person. Isn't this an interesting doorway and very, very interesting motif there? What do we have? The giant cat or panther of doom from the Garfield cartoon. And it looks like we've got an eagle or a phoenix, depending on your interpretation. Whatever other details in this unbelievable building. We're only looking at the outside of it right now. Just wait until we get to the interior. I'm still trying to fathom how exactly they achieved this unbelievable achievement within 6 years, 1920 to 1926. Just in the years after World War I, and also after the outbreak of a nasty influenza that was a worldwide pandemic. Right after that, in fact, that was still going on when they started constructing this building. I mean, I guess they give us a little bit more credit by telling us it actually took them 6 years. But just looking at the exterior detail with all the windows going on in the vast towers and the way the towers meet at the top, there's a reason why I question if this building had some greater function. Here's our construction photo, and again you see issues with scaling, you see the vanilla skies and the usual challenges that we have. Why exactly does it appear as though there's always such signs of symmetry when they construct these things? Is that really how they did it? And I'm seriously asking. There's just something that seems a little off about some of these photos. Namely, it's always the absence of workers, and look at the power lines running right up there to the side of the building. Well, I guess they weren't concerned about that. What is really going on here? 1923, so in only 3 more years they'd have this building finished. And here's another exterior detail. And again, seeing beautiful figures that are carved up above the doorway or assembled above the doorway. I mean, who knows exactly how this was done? We'll be told that it was assembled in pieces. Well, if it looks like it was assembled in pieces in the photographs, I wonder if it was. But I'll again elicit, this is an interesting figure, I'll elicit your responses in the feedback to see what you think. A little interesting coloration, too, on that rather ghastly-looking court gesture sort of figure, and whatever meaning that has. And again, I'm just taking this all at face value. I'm not looking into the meanings behind any of this, because I think that's how we have to approach these explorations. And here, more ornate detail. Very intriguing figures. And I have seen this on many other buildings, and figures like this on other buildings, not just on Masonic temples, or the largest Masonic temple in the world. Or do we want to call it the largest royal palace or royal capital in the world? Yes, look at this stage here. And look at the beautiful ornate detail in the ceiling. And I believe this is the venue that you can fit 1,000 people in. Looks like you can fit 1,000 people in there. So you can put on your greatest indoor concerts. Or perhaps you could do your coronation ceremony if you're Ming the Merciless and want to have yourself declared Emperor of the Universe. Anybody knows what series that's from, let me know. Ah, yes, we have to put the year in it. Apparently that's the cornerstone, 1922. Look at this. Wow. Just an incredible room that gives the same trappings that we've seen of many cathedrals with the archways and the detail. And look at the floor. There is no beauty and no expense spared in the interior of this building. And this is really something that defies simple explanation. And here it looks like we've got a ballroom. So, after Ming the Merciless has himself declared ruler of the universe, then he can go marry his Empress of the Hour, Dale Arden, and enjoy it. And hopefully Flash doesn't show up to disrupt the ceremony. Yeah, I'm talking about the 1980 movie, if anybody's wondering. Maybe I'm losing my mind because I'm just looking at too many of these buildings, but there is just something about this Masonic temple that is truly mind-blowing. Look at the detail in the ceiling. Just this kind of venue. I mean, this is something you could film any movie in, and this would be a very convincing set for anything from some large parliamentarian proceedings or large meeting or august body. And it would look so convincing. Okay, got to move on from this one. All right, I have to have a little fun to close this one off. This is Canadian-American actor Matthew Perry. He's famous as Chandler from the Friends franchise. And then on the right there we have Matthew C. Perry, the naval officer. Do you think that Matt Perry could portray his namesake? I think he could if he just grew his hair out a little bit. And maybe if he went on a drunken bender or two. Or he just acted like Chandler did. Was Chandler the nice guy? I don't know. I never really watched Friends. Don't hold it against me. Consider joining the channel as a member. You can be an explorer and receive early access to content, or you can be a Prime Explorer and have exclusive content that you can't watch on the regular channel. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me today.